Greetings, friends of liberty. It should now be hopefully recognized by all and sundry that one of the unsung heroes of our English history was not just William Caxton, who in 1476 introduced printing, and not just Larry Matey Montague, who in 1721 pioneered inoculation for preventing smallpox, but also the little-known curate of Calverton in Nottingham, the Reverend William Lee. As custom has it, while courting a young lady of the neighbourhood, he was subjected to a feminine tactic often employed throughout all of recorded history, indifference. And how, in particular, did she manifest this indifference? She knitted, whilst he conversed with her, or you might say, at her. Now, this cold style of knitting occurred for so many consecutive months that the Reverend, in the end, was filled with a great determination, he resolving to construct a knitting machine for her so that she might finally be free to look upon him instead of her needles. And so he set to task, overcoming first the obstacle of allowing the thread to pass by the hooks, by thinking to make, after hundreds of experiments, a groove in the needle itself, using a special file. Secondly, thinking to insert 8 of these modified needles into a wooden frame, hence the name stocking frame. And thirdly, to fashion tiny wooden levers for each needle to allow them to catch the thread in a loop. Having thus, painstakingly, over the course of more than 3 years, improvised these developments, which could, with only some slight manual labour, by an operator, knit woolen stockings quickly and well, our good Reverend thought to receive a patent for his invention. And so he dutifully travelled with his machine to the court of Elizabeth, hoping that she would recognize the value of this creation. However, our sovereign, usually wise, here set her face against progress and refused him a patent, allegedly because his machine wouldn't knit silk stockings, and also because she said it would put many woolen weavers out of work. One can only imagine that if the Virgin Queen had been more used to the ways of men, she might have felt in a better humour and granted him his wish, if you understand me. In any case, our inventor, though discouraged, went to work again and, over the course of 7 more years, improved his machine by adding 12 more needles, it now having 20. Thus enabling it to knit silk as well. Nonetheless, Elizabeth, in the meantime having expired when he returned to court, he was again refused, this time by James I. These simple failures of government prevented him from manufacturing his machine on a massive scale and thus gaining the profits from its sale, which could have funded further improvements. Now, if we turn to the issue of the stifling of the progress of inventions in your own 20th and 21st centuries in America, we find today a similar and just as momentous failure to grant property rights here with regard to the wireless spectrum. In the political spectrum, the tumultuous liberation of wireless technology from Herbert Hoover to the smartphone, Thomas Hazlett, author of 3 books and economist at Clemson, delivers a comprehensive and decisive verdict on how the American and Western use of the radio spectrum, with the enormous access to knowledge it has facilitated for billions of people, was constantly hindered in its development and use by American regulatory agencies. As James Madison said, how easily are base and selfish measures masked by pretexts of public good and apparent efficacy. Wireless all began in 1895 when inventor Guglielmo Marconi allegedly first transmitted a wireless message from one bank of the Thames to the other. Soon radio traffic doubled every 2 years, a sort of radio equivalent to Moore's law regarding CPUs. And as Hazlett remarks, this furious pace is not slackening. The Apple iPhone, introduced in 2007, triggered a smartphone revolution. From 2008 through 2011, global mobile data flows increased not by the long-term trend of 4x, but by 30x, more than doubling each year. U.S. regulators call this the mobile data tsunami. In the very beginning, the U.S. government, following common law precedent, assigned frequencies on a first-come, first-served basis. By 1924, there were 89 channels between 550 kilohertz and 1500 kilohertz, essentially today's AM dial. However, in 1926, the Republican Herbert Hoover astonishingly refused to enforce that radio stations must stay within their assigned frequency band. The result? The roughly 550 stations on the air were soon joined by 200 more. Many jumped channels, conflicts, spread annoying listeners. Meanwhile, the Department of Commerce, which Hoover headed, did nothing. As Hazlett says, the predictable confusion over rights could have been remedied by renewed Commerce Department enforcement of the appropriate frequency bands or by the courts. Either path could have been supported by legislation. But instead, the FRC, the Federal Radio Commission, was created by Congress, by which broadcasters were required to waive ownership rights in the ether, and a new regulatory agency, the FRC, the Federal Radio Commission, was created. Its 5 members, nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, would enjoy broad powers to define how radio waves could be used and who could use them. Soon the agency simply eliminated a quarter of all radio stations owned almost entirely by small businesses or nonprofit organizations like schools or labor unions. The FRC immediately and destructively, A, rejected expanding the AM dial to 200 kilohertz, which would have increased the number of stations by about 50%, and B, rejected putting stations closer to one another on the spectrum. And thus, less than 2 months into its existence, the FRC had done the bidding of influential corporate interests, exacerbating scarcity and attributing the outcomes inevitably to spurious technical reasons. Not only that, but by 1929, the FRC was evaluating license renewals based upon the fairness of the political material aired by the station, a clear violation of the First Amendment. A typical instance of this was when a very popular LA Christian radio station, run by Reverend Bob Schuler, which effectively campaigned against corrupt politicos, was denied a license renewal. Similarly, a station in New York that focused on the socialist ideas of Eugene V. Debs, with the call sign WEVD, was chastised when the FRC claimed it was a mouthpiece of the Socialist Party. You mean the First Amendment doesn't allow people to talk about socialism? And in England, the paternalists at the BBC banned Winston Churchill in 1938 when he sought to criticize Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's Peace in Our Time treaty with Nazi Germany. In essence, the government under the FRC, and starting in 1934, the FCC, Federal Communication Commission, determined the lineup of programs, favoring a bland mix of entertainment, music, and news that would only appeal to the lowest common denominator, claiming that all this was in the public interest. And thus, it's not surprising that almost 3 decades later, by 1961, when FCC Director Newton Minow called American television a vast wasteland, he was oblivious to his agency's role in creating it. Yet another type of FCC destruction was caused by the constant blocking of innovative new technologies, illustrated perfectly with the brilliant American inventor Edwin H. Armstrong, who developed radios that greatly amplified both AM and FM transmission. When Armstrong unveiled his even newer invention to use parts of the FN band at the Institute of Radio Engineers in New York City in 1935, most of the listening engineers were astonished by what they heard. But not the FCC, which claimed falsely that it was virtually worthless for communications stretching beyond 10 miles. Nonetheless, Armstrong responded by making his transmitter even more powerful, capable of reaching 80 miles on the FM band, and received with greater clarity and far less sensitive to interference than AM broadcasts. And how did the FCC respond? By following NBC and CBS's suggestion to toss every FM station off of its assigned frequency and relocate the entire industry up the dial. All existing equipment, transmitters owned by stations, receivers owned by listeners, would become obsolete. As Armstrong testified in a 1948 Senate hearing, the effort has been to mold the allocation of FM into a form where it will become a network subsidiary, unable to take the leading role which its technical merits would give it if left unhampered by regulation. How did our brilliant inventor, constantly stymied for decades by government officials at every turn, respond? By walking off the 34th floor of a New York skyscraper in 1954. But it wasn't just the FCC, but also the Supreme Court, which claimed that somehow wireless technology was different from the print media, and so the First Amendment just didn't apply. As Justice Felix Frankfurter falsely stated in 1943, radio inherently is not available to all. That is its unique characteristic, and that is why, unlike other modes of expression, it is subject to governmental regulation. But this was false, as explained in great detail by many, especially the free market economist Ronald Coase, who in 1960 pointed out that everything in life is scarce, but that the way to maximize the supply and productivity is to let supply equal demand. With radio, that meant letting stations buy and sell their own frequency bands, charging whatever the market would bear to potential purchasers. In the beginning, people laughed at him, with one senator asking him during a hearing, "Are you spoofing us? Is this all a big joke?" Even a subsequent report commissioned by Rand in 1962 simply wasn't published because, as Rand believed, publishing it is asking for trouble in the Washington big business maelstrom. But by 1990, Coase had won the argument and a Nobel Prize to boot. Partly, too, this was because of the obvious reality as technological knowledge expanded, the material resources available in the spectrum expanded as well, commercially now reaching all the way from 30 to 300 gigahertz. So the simple fact that Coase, but few others initially got, was that property rights could apply to the radio spectrum as everything else in life. So now we come to the so-called fairness doctrine. Started in 1949 and confirmed judicially by the Red Line ruling in 1969, it mandated for both radio and then television that either both sides of an issue be heard or none at all. This inane requirement was again a kind of morals legislation, in direct violation of the First Amendment, which no one would expect or require of any newspaper. It meant that, for example, A, a station, WCFL, run exclusively to promote organized labor, was denied a license. B, the stations had to provide airtime for free to anyone who wanted to disagree. And C, not constantly providing both sides could result in losing a radio or television license. But what happened after President Reagan's veto finally abolished the Fairness Doctrine in 1987? After both houses of Congress, Dems and Republicans all, tried to re-legislate it? Information-based formats took off. In 1987, just 7.1% of AM stations were classified as news talk, or public affairs. But by 1995, some 27.6% were FM stations. FM stations saw a similar trend. So again, the result of spectrum freedom, with Reagan here having enabled it, all by having had the courage to vote against the advice of Newt Gingrich and other Republicans. Of course, none of those Republicans subsequently complained when, as a result of Reagan's veto, Mr. Rush Limbaugh, the biggest right-wing talker, exploded in popularity as a result and drew 13.5 million listeners a year. Let's now turn more specifically to television, Here, just as with radio, the FCC assigned stations without monetary payment, but licensees had to pledge to satisfy a vaguely defined public interest standard. The FCC again also set its face against technological innovation. In the case of the network Dumont, refusing to allow them to create a system with fewer cities with TV stations, but to have each station cover a large geographical area spanning a number of cities. This would have permitted the creation of new networks and increased the number of choices available to each viewer, increasing diversity of programming. But the FCC nixed that proposal, with the result that Dumont went bankrupt because it simply was not capable of being reached in most markets, which only allowed the three broadcast stations, NBC, CBS, and ABC. But these monopolists would have their comeuppance, since now the age of cable was upon us. Cable had first started in 1948 when John Walson in Pennsylvania started Service Electric, running cables out of his showroom to his customers, increasing channel choice and reception clarity. By the 1960s, cable TV systems began to serve not just the TV-deprived neighborhoods beyond the reach of off-air reception, but markets where off-air television was well established. To protect their turf against a growing competitor, incumbent broadcasters began demanding that the FCC take action. And so, from 1965 through 1970, the FCC aggressively discouraged cable by imposing federal franchises and anti-siphoning rules. They also banned cable stations from showing movies less than 10 years old. But soon, the spirit of deregulation that accompanied the 1970s and Carter's presidency, with his administration deregulating the trucking and airline industries, also resulted in deregulation of federal cable franchises and content restrictions. By 1988, more than half of all American homes subscribed to cable. By 2000, 85% did. What made cable so popular was that it constituted a revolution in programming, heralding an enormous increase in every kind of coverage. The Discovery and History channels, Al Jazeera, CNN, CNBC, Comedy Central, National Geographic, Fox News, South Park, MSNBC, HBO, Animal Planet, Showtime, Mythbusters, Dexter, House, and The Wire, just to name a few. C-SPAN's founder, Brian Lamb, understandably said, "I don't want government anywhere near me." Incidentally, however, the so-called must-carry rules are still imposed on cable, which force them to carry local programming for free, which means that programming that many users would find more interesting is not carried. And last, but certainly not least in this history, was the cell phone, the first call ever being made in 1973 by the New York vice president of Motorola, Marty Cooper, calling his research rival in AT&T in New Jersey to taunt him of their breakthrough. In the 1980s, cell phones produced huge gains in capacity by splitting up markets into scores of cells. Radios powered down, transmitting just to the nearest base station, which connected the mobile user with public switched network. Again, showing the fallacy of Justice Frankfurter's natural scarcity argument. Partly as a consequence, standard speeds for mobile data applications rose from 9.6 kilobits per second to more than 10 megabits per second, a thousand-fold increase. And in contrast to the tragic fate of the inventor of amplified FM radio, Edwin Armstrong, Steve Jobs lived to see his latest futuristic visions, the iPhone and the iPad, sweep the globe thanks to spectrum rules that allowed markets to welcome innovation. The great irony, however, was that cell phone development had also initially been greatly stifled, with the FCC refusing to allow an AT&T prototype to deploy in 1946, the FCC saying that the spectrum could be best used by other services that were not in the nature of convenience or luxury. This view that cellular would be a niche service for a tiny user base persisted well into the 1980s. But, as Hazlett says, this was a false dichotomy. Americans could have enjoyed all the broadcast TV they would watch, in, say, 1960 and had cellular phone service too. So whilst the FCC's rationale had been to save the cellular bandwidth for television, just 3.5% of the channels set aside for television were actually transmitting signals a decade later. All this meant that the world of cellular we see around us today, that by some estimates offered a consumer surplus in 2008 of $212 billion, was delayed for at least a couple of decades by U.S. regulatory agencies, a typical instance being when AT&T formally requested a cellular allocation in 1958, and the FCC did not respond until 1968, a decade later. So at least hypothetically, Americans back in the year 2000 could have had the kind of cellular tech they have today if only the FCC hadn't gotten in the way. As Hazlett summarizes, however one counts the regulatory lag, 10, 11, or 37 years, it was a joint effort of powerful TV broadcasters and the small radio common carriers. And partly this was because few people understood the enormous potential of cellular, with an FCC official saying in 1982, it's not going to be something you and I put in the car to call home and say, we're on the way home for dinner. Similarly, McKinsey's consultants estimated maximum worldwide cell phone usage at only 1 million phones by the year 2000. The reality? 109 million. And Google with its Android operating system, and Steve Jobs with his beautiful consumer products, and both with apps ranging from OnStar to Twitter to WhatsApp to YouTube. Hazlett covers many additional developments as well, such as the use of Wi-Fi spread spectrum technology, the failed political attempt to impose a high-definition digital TV standard, the failure of municipal governments to efficiently use their airwaves, how the attempted imposition of affirmative action failed in selling the spectrum for mobile markets, costing consumers some $100 billion, and how mobile carriers, effectively private FCCs, police the mix of devices and applications, sharing their airspace much better than the actual FCC ever could. All this, again and again, showing how destructive the governmental violation of property rights in the wireless spectrum has been for over a century. For this, Hazlett deserves an A+. Happy for my part that we English, despite Queen Elizabeth's failure to grant William Lee a patent, are nonetheless, with our patent system, in the process of developing an extraordinarily capable textile industry. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.